Hello again. In chapter 13 of Matthew, we have Jesus teaching his disciples and a crowd of followers about the inner workings of the kingdom of heaven, and he does so with a number of parables. Parables convey truth by way of comparison or analogy. They're like extended illustrations that really engage the listener in figuring out for him or herself what the truth is that is being conveyed in this indirect, elusive manner. Jesus' teaching from last week and this week uses images from the world of agriculture, which were intimately familiar to his audience. They knew all about the seasonal rhythm of clearing the ground, tilling the soil, sowing the seeds, tending the plants as they grew, and finally, the joy of harvesting. Those activities are as old as agriculture itself. For the sake of saving some time, I will only read last week's text, the parable of the sower. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, "A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear." Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. That is the seed sown along the path. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop, yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. You're looking at a vase. It's called the harvester's vase, and technically, the Greek word is raiton. It's a vessel used for ceremonial libations or rituals. It comes from Minoan Crete. Crete is circled on the map, so it predates all the classical Greek sculpture and ceramics that you might be familiar with. In fact, it was probably made somewhere around 1500 BC. Even then, the joy of the harvest was being celebrated. I worked with an educational program in Crete a long time ago, and I made it a point to go to the archaeological museum in Heraklion, expressly to see this small piece. It's only about 4.5 inches in diameter. There were other things I wanted to see as well, but this was a standout. In this slide, you can see that one man is holding up a musical instrument called a sistrum, and a number of the men around him have their mouths open and they sing to celebrate the harvest that they're bringing in. We are so fortunate to have this little piece of the past to help us visualize how vital the whole process of sowing and reaping has been through the ages. This piece alone takes us back more than 3,500 years. We may be less familiar with agricultural activities today, but we're certainly familiar with Jesus' parable of the sower, and perhaps we're too familiar. It occurs in all three synoptic gospels and has worked its way into popular culture, so that even those who may not know much about the Bible know something about the parable of the sower. And that's where art can perhaps awaken in us a new appreciation of Jesus' words, if our ears have grown a little too accustomed to hearing the story. Moving forward in time by 3,000 years, we're looking at a painting by the Flemish artist Peter Bruegel. As often happens with Bruegel, he gives us not just a landscape, but a worldscape. The warm browns and deep greens of the foreground give way to various gradations of blue, and finally they white out into what seems like the end of the world. The technique of creating distance this way is called atmospheric or aerial perspective. This universal view is even more amplified because we're looking down from high above the scene. And this is a perfect perspective for the subject of the painting, which is the parable of the sower. And I say that because the story itself is timeless, it's universal. Enclosed within the red oval is the sower himself. And you can also just make out in the background the little white and black birds that are eager to snatch up the seed as fast as he scatters it. In the circle on the right, you can spot a boat and a crowd of people gathering, which reminds us that Jesus was forced to move a slight distance off the shore and into a boat to preach, because the crowd was pressing in on him as he recounted the parables of the kingdom. In the foreground, you can see more of the obstacles that the sower faced. It's not just birds, but stumps and stony ground and the weeds that are ever present, ready to take over. And yet, further off on the right, we see that a crop is also being brought in. An abundant field is in the process of being harvested. So, in relatively small compass, the painting's about 29 by 40 inches, Bruegel has captured the universal scene of Jesus down at the shore teaching about the sower. And Bruegel also gives us the sower himself. He shows us the challenges he faces with the birds, the rocky ground, the weeds, as well as the results he can hope to achieve with a successful harvest. I think that is part of the message that Jesus had for his disciples, and I think artists and all people involved in creating things can draw a lot of comfort from it too. He's sending his followers out into a world that would often be indifferent, if not downright hostile, to what they were trying to offer. Some people might respond immediately with enthusiasm, only to drop away after a short time. Others might seem to really be into the message. They get it, and they want to go deeper. But then they get distracted. They're concerned about finances. They want to travel. They don't have time. The family has pressing needs. There are many reasons. And this is what artists experience all the time. They too are trying to sow their seeds, present new ideas or ways of looking at things, and they often experience the same indifference or complete rejection. But the good news that Jesus has for his disciples and it's good news for all people involved in creative endeavors, is that sometimes when you send out a message, it's received fantastically with great enthusiasm. Some people actually start to understand and appreciate the vision that's being offered. They want to be part of it, they want to learn more, they want to share it with their friends. And that makes it all worthwhile. That's why the sowers should never stop sowing. The artists should never stop creating, and the writers should never stop writing. Because you just never know when the harvest will come in, where it will happen, how it will look. It might come long after they're gone. That's pretty much what happened to the artist that we will look at next week in some depth, Vincent van Gogh if you wish. I'll just call him Vincent. But first I want to introduce you to an artist that had a huge influence on Vincent, an artist who continued to inspire him from his first baby steps in art right up to his tragic end. That artist was Jean-François Millet. This is a portrait made in the early days of photography. And here you're looking at one of his most iconic images, the sower. Millet was a man of deep faith, and he knew the work of the farmer. He came from a farming family and had worked long hours in the fields. This gave him a special tenderness toward all working people, those whom the French would have called peasants in his day. France at this time, 1850, when this painting was produced, France had just undergone one of her many revolutions in 1848, and the issues fought over at that time were far from satisfied. The Industrial Revolution was happening. More and more people were crowding into cities, trying to find work in the new factories or building the railways. Money was increasingly concentrated in the hands of wealthy bankers, speculators, and businessmen. People who remained in the countryside, working the land, felt that their voices were not being heard, that while big investments were being made in industry, infrastructure, construction, and finance, they were finding it harder and harder just to make ends meet. So there was enormous tension between the urban and rural population and between the wealthy businessmen and bankers on the one hand, and the more conservative, traditional shop owners, the bakers, the shoemakers, the cheesemongers, on the other hand. This tension had caused the revolution in 1848, and the tension continued to percolate just beneath the surface. That is why, when this painting arrived at the French Salon in 1850, the annual French art show in Paris, it caused an uproar. Millet's Sower is an incredibly impressive figure. He fills the canvas. The dynamic angles created by his arms and legs suggest speed, power, and movement. The artist has deliberately elongated his body. If a canonic body in art is 7.5 heads high, now that's the standard or norm, our sower exceeds that by 1.5 heads. He is 9 heads tall, which would make him 6 feet 8 inches, big by any standards and gigantic by French standards and by the conventions of classical art. To a French population that was always nervous about the possibility of a popular uprising, this image of a towering Goliath striding through the fields and down toward the viewer was unnerving, even menacing. And the sower is an anonymous figure. Millet deliberately hid his face in shadow. He could be any man. He could be every man who worked the fields and felt that he had been left behind by an increasingly industrialized and urbanized society. Millet does soften the impact a little bit by including the image of a harvester on the hill, where the waning afternoon sun is still shining. There will be a harvest, but Millet's critics were left wondering what message the sower himself was sowing, and indeed, what sort of harvest this vision of a sower might portend. Whatever the message, Vincent certainly got it and ran with it. From the beginning of his career as an artist, Vincent loved the figure of the sower. These are his first very faltering drawings of what would become his favorite subject. Millet's Sower would be a touchstone for Vincent for the rest of his life. It never ceased to inspire him. But that will be the subject we will look at next week. In the meantime, stay safe, be well, God bless, and see you soon.